president of Transspectrum, and Transspectrum and the LGBT Resource Center welcomes you for coming tonight and to listen to Julie Numacek. I do want to tell you a few things that are also going on because we're having her kick off our TDOR week, which is Transgender Day of Remembrance. On Tuesday at 8 p.m. in Ensemble 1115, we're having our cut and paste, which is our educational piece. And we're doing kind of a Trans 101. And we'll be doing it again on Friday at 5 p.m. in 1115 Ensemble. So it's the same room, so there wasn't any confusion in that. But the Reverend Dr. Julie Numacek is one of Michigan's leading voices on transgender issues. She has spoken on university and college campuses, churches, and even occasionally high schools. She consults with community groups, churches, and small businesses, and Fortune 500 companies, and has lobbied on LGBT issues at local, state, and national levels. She is a former co-director of Michigan Equality. Dr. Numacek serves on a national board of Soul Force and PFLAG, as well as the board of Jackson PFLAG. She is also the advisor board for the Trans Youth Family Allies, TYFA, and is an ex-officer member of the City of Jackson Human Relations Commission. Julie has been married to Joanne for nearly 40 years. She has 3 sons, 4 grandsons, and 1 granddaughter. She has delivered a child, climbed a mountain, parachute from a plane, cooked a 12-course dinner for 6, shot a 78 in golf, traveled internationally to England, France, Ireland, India, Italy, Mexico, and Switzerland. She enjoys life and helping others understand transgender people and the issues they face. Please help me welcome Julie Numacek.
Thank you very much. I put those last few things in there so to make it myself a little more human. Those are things I've loved to do and enjoy doing. It's good to be here again. I was here when Donna Rose spoke a couple years ago. Donna's a good friend and certainly an ally for us. And I'm pleased to be able to kind of kick off the Transgender Day of Remembrance. For those that don't know my story, I'll give you a quick shorthand version of it. I was an associate professor and assistant dean for the largest school of the university at Spring Arbor University. And when I came out, it was a rather public coming out, through no fault of my own. When I told the university that I was trans, and at that time I wasn't sure if I'd be transitioning right away or not, they immediately wrote a new contract for me, cut my pay by 20%, and put some restrictions on me that only applied to me and nobody else in the university. So that was a very difficult time. Eventually I filed an EEOC complaint, which they ignored except for some retaliatory actions. And then finally had nothing left to lose and went and told the story to a local reporter. And he wrote an award-winning story that came out front page above the fold in Super Bowl Sunday in 2007. It's about 2,800 words in 2 stories. One on the front page and then one on the front page of the Living Today section. The Associated Press picked up the story. It went coast to coast in less than 24 hours. And I heard from people on 6 different continents. Never heard from anybody from Antarctica, but it really traveled far. Did over 100 media interviews in 2007, including Wall Street Journal, first time they'd ever covered anything trans. Newsweek, a number of newspapers, Fox News, other TV stations, even Christianity Today. So it was a rather interesting year. And gratefully, things have slowed down a little bit, slowed down a little enough that we can catch our breath and move on. I teach part-time at Lansing Community College and then do consulting work and as well as preach occasionally at different churches in southern and mostly western Michigan. Tonight, what I want to do to kind of kick off the whole Remembrance Week that you're celebrating or honoring is I've been asked to talk about on remembrance, you know, what remembrance is all about. And so I'm going to use your help in that. And what I'll do to get us started in our thinking is I'll identify a sense, and I want you to think of the strongest or first memory related to that sense. For example, you've all heard a song on the radio, and sometime that song brings back a memory. Well, I want to do that with all 5 of the senses. So if you're willing, then I'm going to ask you to share it once you come up with your first or strongest memory, as long as it's not X-rated. We'll keep them kind of below the radar there. So let me give you a start with sight. Sight. Okay, what's your first or strongest memory that comes immediately to your mind? It doesn't have to be about LGBT stuff, doesn't have to be about trans stuff, but your first memory of sight that comes to your mind. Go ahead.
Sledding when I was a kid with my... Thank you. Sledding when I was a kid with my mom and my siblings and our dog and putting him on the sled.
Okay.
I guess for me, my mom used to drive bus for school, and this was back in the day when child safety seats weren't mandatory, and so I actually remember sitting on the left-hand side of the driver right there, and I remember seeing the kids and how excited all the kids were in school. That was my first school experience, actually.
Good. There's another one.
I think of the view of Okinawa from the very top of the hill, so you can see both oceans,
Wow.
one on each side.
How long ago was that?
2003.
Great. You're going to get exercise. Thank you.
Seeing the Great Wall of China and like the vastness of it, it was just like I stood on the top of a certain spot and just out of Beijing, and just the vastness, it just stretched on forever.
Anybody else have a sight memory they're willing to share? The one that came to my mind, and I put myself through this exercise too, was when I delivered my youngest son. The sight of seeing him, coming out into my hands was a kind of an incredible experience, especially because our 2 older sons were there to witness it too, and they had gone through a training, and it was in a birthing center in a Chicago hospital, and the youngest son at the time, the youngest of the 2 that saw it, clapped his hands, and the older one, who was about 6, said, "Where's the placenta?" So they had gone through some training about that and wanted to see that. All right, let's shift to sound. When I say sound, what's the strongest or first memory that pops into your mind related to sound?
Oddly enough, the Three Stooges theme song.
The Three Stooges theme song, that's a good one.
Laying under the piano while my best friend played it when I was little.
That's fun to be that close to the sound, isn't it?
When I was younger, I had this thing called a bumble ball. I don't know how many of you know that, but it's a round ball, and it's got little foam spikes, and it's battery operated, and it vibrates and goes vrr sort of thing. And when you put it on the kitchen floor, it makes a loud clattering sound.
It's a neat memory. One of my favorite sound memories, and I think my strongest sound memory, is I studied at Oxford for a short time, and we went to hear an organ concert in one of the chapels. Each of the colleges that are part of Oxford University have their own chapel, and it was a night recital. We were able to sit up in the kind of the choir loft area, so we were pretty close to the organ, and the organ was way up high. Well, with all those stone walls, when the organ stops playing, the music goes on for about 10 more seconds. And just hearing that reverberate throughout the building and thinking of music continuing to go was kind of a fun experience. Other sound memories? Some of you aren't thinking. Smell.
I just relived this one just a couple of days ago. So when I was really, really, really little, my dad was the director of IT at Calvin College back when the computers were huge, and they gave off this certain smell that I just always equated with my dad. And when I drove on Calvin's campus to drop off a friend of mine, the memory of that smell actually came into my back into my mind as I was driving by the building my dad used to work in.
Yeah, when I worked in college, I worked for Xerox corporate headquarters in security work, but they had a room like this for their computers. You know, they were just monsters. Go ahead.
The first thought when it comes to smell is probably vanilla, because I have vanilla candles that burn in my room all the time before I go to bed.
Neat. One here and then one there, maybe some more.
That old people apartment smell. When I was very young, my great-grandmother lived in a retirement home in upstate New York, where my mom is from, and she always smelled like old people. Could never get over she was not that old. And every time I walk into any kind of medical facility, I just smell old people. It's, you know, they have a smell. It's an odoriferous, you know?
It's hard to describe in a few words, too, isn't it?
My mother's perfume. I don't know why, but I always loved it. And when I was little, I can just smell it out of all the perfumes in the room. I know my mom's perfume.
Yeah, there's some fragrances that I can do that, some perfumes that I can do that with. Name them when I smell them.
My friend Kai had this amazing cologne, and I almost cried when I found out they discontinued it, because something about him mixed with this cologne was just fantastic. Random people would just always come up to him and smell him and be like, oh my God, you smell so good. It got to be a norm for him, for strangers to come up and smell him.
It'd be funny being in a restaurant and have people come up sniffing you.
Diesel fuel and oil.
Yeah.
My dad's a mechanic and has been since he was 17. And then the first summer that I was with my boyfriend, he was working around large vehicles and stuff, so he would always come over to my house after work and smell like diesel fuel and oil. So it's just something that I've been around since I was an infant, and I love it.
You're going to make a perfume out of...
For me, it's the old hat smell. I would steal my dad's baseball caps, his cowboy hats, and his father's fedoras, so that was a big one for me.
Good. Any others? I have a smoker that uses wood chips, and every once in a while I like to get a pork shoulder and spend 10 or 12 hours smoking it all day, and it makes a wonderful taste, which is another sense that we'll talk about. But I keep that smoker in the garage, and sometimes when I'm getting out of my car, I'll smell that smoker and I'll salivate because it reminds me of that pork roast. So that's a smell that gets me. How about a taste?
Well, it didn't really taste too well, but every year I went to this hotel for our state tournament for a club I was in, and the first year when I realized you weren't supposed to eat the eggs for breakfast when the hotel gave them out to you, because they had an en masse breakfast, and they were just absolutely horrible, but that would definitely be the strong one. They were that bad.
You can kind of still taste them, huh? Here, either one?
Carrot pineapple Jell-O. My mom used to sneak vegetables into my food as a child because I still don't like vegetables, and carrots were the obvious choice, so now I hate carrots, and especially in Jell-O. So that is a horrible taste, and I still can't get over it. She still does it.
She's trying to sneak those vegetables in still, huh?
Okay, it's not really X-rated, but it's kind of romantic-wise. That first kiss or even those several kisses when you're still extremely infatuated with the person, seems like it's a little bit sweeter than normal. I don't know.
That is a great sensation.
I think of the medication I used to have to take. It's such a vivid taste that it makes my throat tight. Like I feel anxious when I think about it.
That was a bitter taste. There's one in the back there.
My mom, whenever she would make homemade pies, she'd take the extra pie crust and make these one-of-a-kind like cinnamon roll-ups, and they're like nothing I've ever tasted before. They're amazing.
My mom used to do that too. That is amazing taste. Yeah. My mom used to make Jell-O when we were sick. She'd make the strawberry and banana Jell-O, though. She didn't try to sneak vegetables in. While he's coming, a taste memory that came to me when I was thinking about this. It was for a major birthday. I think it might have been for Joanne's 50th. We were at a restaurant in Kalamazoo, and I paid big bucks for a wine. First time I spent 3 figures for a bottle of wine. But it was incredible because as the air hit it, it changed its taste over the course of the meal. And just it really got better and better and better. And it was an unusual experience. Most of my wines don't do that, but that one did. So I remember that.
The one food that my family's always made, what's more of a dessert, is this thing called no-bake cookies. It's kind of like chocolate peanut butter oat fudge, and it made it even more exciting when my boyfriend, I realized that he had the same recipe in his family, because most of the time I mention it and people are like, what are you talking about? So yeah, it reminds me so much of home that I make it every once in a while and feel a little closer to my family.
Good.
My mom made no-bake cookies too. When we had a friend who came and moved in with us, and part of the agreement was that she would cook dinner for us because mom charged her almost nothing for rent to move in, but this woman learned how to cook at like some amazing place, or her mom was a great cook or something. Like everything she made tasted like gold. It was so like how much gold is worth. Like I would pay in gold to get her food. It was so good. And the first time she made us beef and noodles with homemade beef and like pot roast, it was so good.
Bad memories, good memories. They evoke images in our head. They evoke a whole sense of being. It's an interesting thing. Any more for the sense of taste? One more.
The first time I ever had Lebanese food was probably when I was about 7, and my mom's side of the family is like Lebanese, so imagine my big fat Greek wedding with Lebanese people. Literally, that's my family. And so the first time I had it, I thought it was kind of gross at first, but then as soon as I kept eating more, I just wanted to eat and eat. And so every single time we had a big family get together, I was the littlest and smallest, so I would run and cut in front of everyone just to eat the food. It was awesome. So every single time I go to my grandma's, I get really excited because I love Lebanese food.
It's in your genes, apparently, huh? Anyone else? Sense of taste? Last one, touch.
Last December, about a year ago now, my friend gave birth. She was 16, and she gave her daughter up for adoption. And in the room, like, I was just her best friend, and so I didn't really know my place, so I never got to hold her. And so this summer, when her daughter turned 6 months, actually, like 2 days after, I went to church, and her daughter was there, and I got to hold her for the first time. And it was like, it's not really like touch, but, I was still holding her, touching her. And it was like one of those like really magical moments because, like I was there for her birth, you know, like I was kind of the coach, and I finally got to hold her, and it was like one of those like magical moments. Like, it was really awesome.
Mine's actually really similar to that. My brother, I'm the youngest out of my family because my dad was married 3 times. So I have 2 older brothers that are like 35 and 30, and they live in the South, so I never get to see them. And my brother had, well, he didn't have it, but his girlfriend had a baby. I didn't get to hold her for a really long time because they were so far away. But this fall, they came up, and I got to hold her for the first time. And they like said that she never goes to anyone right away, like ever. And she like went to me like right away, and just like it was really cool.
The really soft fluff on my cat's chin. Because you can't always get to their chin. They might bite you. But he lets me do this. And it's very, very, very soft.
And they purr gently when you're doing it?
Yeah.
I have anxiety issues with texture. And so there are certain things that I just can't touch. Like, I have to, when it comes to touch, I have to really dry my hands well. I can't have them be moist or whatever. And also bananas. Bananas, the texture of bananas just drive me crazy. So those are definite major touch issues that come to mind for me.
Old Navy's clothes are so soft. The inside of this jacket is like the softest thing ever, and their t-shirts are amazing, and they were on sale, so we bought like 10 million of them.
The first time I ever held my fiance's hand, we were at a conference, and I just felt the most alive I had ever felt in my entire life, and I just knew she was going to be the one I was going to spend the rest of my life with. And she was surprised when I told her I loved her a week later.
Kind of on those lines. I guess even as an infant, I loved the feel of skin. Like, I guess when I was breastfeeding, I would just like rub the skin above my mom's chest just raw, because I just loved the feel of skin. And, you know, over 20 years later, here I am I still love the feel of skin, and it's really soft, and it feels really nice, and I just really like it.
Touch has a tremendous healing power to it. Just being able to let someone know that we're there with touch is powerful. And they train hospital chaplains to, you know, make sure that when you're visiting someone, you know, hold their hand or touch in some way. And there's a connection there that happens with touch that's pretty powerful.
Mine is kind of along those same cheesy, sentimental lines. When I'm sick or sad, my boyfriend kisses me on the forehead, and when I'm crying, he'll kiss me on the cheek. And that's just like, I almost want to cry all the time, just that way he'll do it. Because it's like an instant pick-me-up. There's nothing better in the whole world than him.
That's neat. Mine's along those cheesy lines too. While you're going back here, Joanne and I, you know, always. She's an awesome woman. Couldn't be here tonight because she's in school at MSU to get a master's in social work, so she can work with LGBT people as a counselor. Right now, she's a surgical nurse, but we always make it the point, and we both have pretty busy schedules to end the day in each other's arms, you know, and then the rest of the world can go away at that moment. You know, it doesn't. Nothing else matters but that touch.
Okay, I'm going to change the mood a little bit. This one's not a great sensation. I must be pessimistic today. But so my little brother, he's 15, and he was 15 when I was a senior, and he would have these fainting spells, and so you would have to catch him before he fell. And one time he was almost going to fall off my bed, and so I had to grab his legs. And like, I don't know, for some reason, that's the moment decided to hit me that he wasn't a little kid anymore. And it's just grabbing his legs like, I didn't grab his pants, I grabbed his actual legs, and I don't know, I wasn't expecting, like, body hair, and so I'm grabbing his hairy legs going, ew, while trying to pull him out to not land on my bed, land on my floor.
Good one. Anyone else? The point of the exercise is that when we experience an event, our brains kind of take all the sights and sounds and touches and smells and tastes together and combine them with our own impressions together into a relationship with that event. That event itself is the memory that we experience. The memory of that event is that relationship that all those different senses bring together. Memory represents a change in who we are. That's just the physiological thing that takes place when a memory is etched in our thinking. It changes who we are as a person because of some new experience. For example, a very simple one, the first time you touch something that's hot, that stays in your memory. And the next time you see something that's hot, you're not going to reach out and touch it. So memory has that kind of purpose for us. I suspect all of you can remember where you were on 9/11, what you were doing, who you were with, maybe even some of the sights and sounds and smells and wherever, all that was taking place. Because it was such a powerful event that all of those things came together and formed a relationship in your thinking. In many ways, this week, in terms of a week of remembrance, is for reliving senses. It's for, in part, reliving emotions, reliving tears, yes, but also some smiles along the way too. When we remember people that were close to us, it brings sometimes tears, sometimes smiles. My father died about 4 years ago, and in many ways that was a welcome end to a very long and difficult battle with cancer. But I miss him, you know, and Memorial Day, Veterans Day, I was thinking about him because he was a World War II vet, and other times, you know, special events, certainly the anniversary of his death and other things bring to mind a memory. I was coming back from his funeral when I got a call from Colette about doing a memorial service for a young person who had taken his life as a result of bullying. And he had followed my situation with the university with interest and was happy to see that I was standing up for myself, and it was an honor for me to say, yes, I'll be glad to do it. It was a very difficult time. It was a candlelight service out in the middle of the football field, I think it was, or soccer field at that school. People holding candles and a couple of people speaking. But in many ways, that death stayed with me more than my father's death as something that really is etched in my memory. You know, the early death of a young person just to me is such a tragedy when there's so much life yet to happen. And part of what we're doing this week is to think about many of those lives that were taken away by acts of violence, by others, but also those that died through acts of violence at their own hand. I think that's part of the time of remembrance too, because the societal violence that leads to bullying and other kinds of things leads to those kinds of violent deaths just as much. So it's a way of reliving emotions. It's a way of embracing those tears and those smiles that we remember about people. Remembrance is also for keeping the past, people and ideas. My three boys are all old now, much older. They're, let me see, 39, 30, no, 30, 36, 33, and 30. And they all have kids of their own. But you know, part of me remembers them when they were little. And you see them and you imagine, how could that little something turn out to be this something, you know? But to remember the people, to remember to keep that past dear to us. It's to hold those who are dear to us and close to us. Now, many of you, most of you probably, don't know some of the people that will be, any of the people that will be remembered this week personally. John Donne wrote a poem about No Man is an Island. And in that poem he said, you know, any man's death diminishes us. Any person's death diminishes us. And he's the one that penned the line, don't send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And we don't understand that line except that if we understand the culture. And the culture in those days, if somebody died, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have the internet. And so the church would ring out a death knell. And people would listen to that ringing of the bells. The pattern of the ringing of the bells would let them know somebody had died. And then at the end of the death knell, they would ring one bell for each year of that person's life. And so people would be thinking, who do I know that's that old? You know, and so they would send someone to see who had died, send someone to the church. And that's where John Donne says, don't send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That person's loss in the community is your loss, is your death. And I think part of what this week of remembrance is about is that we are one in community in the LGBT and allies community, and genderqueer and questioning and every other letter of the alphabet that you want to add. We are one. And so when something like this happens, it happens in a very real sense to us, and we need to take it to heart. To hold those dear to us still, remembering the past, is important. It's also helpful in exams when you have to remember all the stuff that you studied in the past. Remembrance is not just for reliving things or for the past, it's also for the future. And I hope this week you can focus on that part of it as well. That's why we learn not to touch a hot stove, because we go forward thinking with our past experience. These trans deaths and other deaths within the LGBT community, they are times when we should be looking forward to learn and go forward, to understand what caused that death and see if there's something we can do in any small way, any large way, to make sure as few of those lives that are lost as possible. What I'd like to encourage you to do this week is to remember some lines from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I suspect most of you had to memorize that at some time in your schooling, 7 years ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I probably could still recite it. I think we had to learn it in 7th or 8th grade. But anyways, there's a line in there that I hope you take to heart. We here, Lincoln said, highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Now, when he was speaking those words, he was looking out over a huge cemetery of people who had died on both sides of the Civil War battle, both the North and the South. And his comments were intended to say that the struggle that was going on is something that should change things, that we hope changes things, that these dead will not have died in vain. So I'd encourage you to use these words and our collective memories and things you'll learn about people that have had their life taken or taken their own life, to look forward with hope, look forward with determination, to use these tragic deaths as a catalyst for change. It will get better when we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. What I'd like to do for the rest of our time together is to take any questions you have about anything. It can be about Day of Remembrance. It can be about my struggles, your struggles, our struggles. I'll be glad to engage in conversation with you about anything that you're coming here with tonight that you'd ask a question about. If I can't answer it, I'm sure there's someone here who can help us answer it. What are you thinking about these days? The end of the semester? I was talking with some earlier. It's about this time of the year when everyone just wants the semester to be over. You know, students, faculty, everyone, just let's get it over with. And let's be done with it, move on to something else. But here's a question.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just tell everyone in this room I am a hate crime survivor. I am transgendered, and I had my head beaten in when I was 17 by a few boys at my high school, and I had reconstructive surgery on the back of my head. They did this specifically because I was dating one of the boys' sisters, who was not worth it, mind you. So Transgender Day of Remembrance always brings to mind a specific gratefulness that I was not one of those who was killed by others' hands. But do you think that Transgender Day of Remembrance is perhaps a remembrance of those who almost lost their lives due to someone else's violence? Not necessarily a part of them. I lost a part of myself that day.
Sure.
My self-pride. And that was gone for a long time until I got here. So do you think that this is a remembrance of everyone's self-pride, or do you think it's almost in line with Transgender Day of Visibility? Should we have pride in ourselves that we weren't one of those?
Yeah, I think there's a sense of solidarity that we should have with those that have lost their lives, because if we think about it, many of these were circumstances where people literally found out somebody was transgender, stalked them, and did them in. And for many of us, we could say quite literally there, but for the grace of God go I. You know, we need to learn to be careful where we park, need to be attentive to when we're going to the car. All of these things become part of our life. And it's sad. But so when we think about those that have lost their life to acts of violence, we should reflect on what we can do to avoid being a victim. And if we have been a victim survivor, as you said, to be grateful for that and to take pause about what we can do. I think that sense of being a survivor in many ways is a very, very difficult thing to overcome. The sense of loss that takes place, the loss of dignity, loss of pride, loss of personhood, takes a while to overcome when we suffer that kind of abuse. Fortunately, you know, in October 2009, for the first time ever, sexual orientation and gender identity were put into a federal bill. Sadly, the bill was a hate crimes bill. So we're protected, but only if we're beat up, you know, or abused in some way, or even murdered. And if it's because of the fact that we're trans or gay or lesbian or bisexual, there's a hate crime that covers it. Bullying is a hate crime. And I think even though bullies aren't prosecuted under the hate crime law, we need to do what we can to end bullying at all levels of society, and it takes place in the workplace as well as in the school place. The incredibly stupid amendment that was made to the Senate bill in Michigan would have enabled bullying, not prevented it. It was an anti-bullying law named after a person who was gay, who was beaten up, put to death. You know, and they're going to call that an anti-bullying law when what they're putting in there that says, well, if you do it for moral or religious reasons, it's okay. I mean, that's just total nonsense. So that somebody could go up and say, well, because of their moral conviction as someone who's Islamic, you're a Christian, you killed my people, you're a hater, you know, and they can say that kind of thing in school. Or they could go up to someone who's a person of color and use a slur because they don't believe that that person is equal because of religious convictions. That's just total nonsense. Fortunately, the House heard the very public outcry. I spoke at PFLAG, the National Convention in D.C. last weekend, and I was surprised to hear people all over the country talking about the stupid law in Michigan. Fortunately, the House of Representatives in Michigan passed the law that took out that. Sadly, they did not pass a law that will have any impact because it does not enumerate LGBT or sexual orientation or gender identity. And all the research says that a bill without enumeration not only is not effective, it is harmful because it gives people the courage to come out thinking that they're protected when they aren't. And that's sad, that's wrong, and it's one of those things that I hope we can fix in the very near future.
Along those lines of the protection when we're not totally protected line of thought, what are your thoughts on local initiatives for creating protections versus like statewide or federal protections? I know when I was working, I felt fairly protected because my company that I worked for was in Grand Rapids, but they still found back doors of ways to get me out of there. So.
Yeah, if an employer wants to fire you, they can find a way to do that. But there are protections, and it's a political question that you're asking, and I honestly think it varies from state to state. In some states, the momentum is strong enough that you can get a statewide initiative, whether it's done through their legislators or through a referendum in there. In other states, you have to chip away at it state by state. Michigan now has 16, 17, depending how you do the counting, cities. Traverse City was the last one last Tuesday that was added, the most recent one that was added. It included protection of housing and employment discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And so we're almost at the tipping point in Michigan. When you add up the population of these different cities, it's pretty close to half the population of the state because they're major cities: Detroit, Grand Rapids, Lansing, Ann Arbor, just down in this area, Kalamazoo as well. And so it really is just about at a tipping point, and that's what has some of the right-wing legislators running scared, and there is one who's putting forth a bill that would erase all those city ordinances from the books and say that every city has to abide by only what is in the state civil rights law, which is an interesting thing because Michigan is the only state in the union that protects people from discrimination based on weight. So you're protected based on weight and religion, but not your sexual orientation or gender identity. Hello? Just doesn't make sense, does it? The other thing that's ironic in Michigan is if you're an inmate, the Department of Corrections prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So if you're inside the walls, you're protected. If you're outside the walls, you're not. Makes you want to get arrested. What else is going through your head? Yeah, in the back.
And what Lincoln was doing, he was asking slaves to forgive their masters, the North to forgive the South to forgive the North. So I guess my question to you is, how do you forgive people who commit these unspeakable acts? How do you forgive people who bash your skull in? I mean, do you forgive them at all? And if you don't, do the dead die in vain, and can we really move forward?
That's a great question. When I was introduced, it was Reverend Doctor. I'm an ordained Baptist minister, although my membership now is in a Presbyterian church that is very warm and welcoming of Joanne and I. We were asked to leave the Baptist church where I was on the Board of Elders and would preach when the pastor was out of town when it became known that I was a transgender. How do you forgive those unspeakable acts of hate? It takes a big person to do that, and for many people it takes time. Part of what makes Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, heroes of mine, is their ability to stand up to abuse, to take abuse for something that was greater than the abuse that they were suffering. I had a chance to see the King Memorial when I was in D.C. last weekend, and it's pretty impressive. But I think that's in part what we have to do, is to say, maybe you can't get to the point where you say, I forgive them. But you can say, maybe, I forgive their ignorance. I forgive their inability to understand. Because there's a cycle that takes place that generates the kind of hate that brings about those acts of violence. Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda minister. That was his official title, propaganda minister. He was the one who said, if you tell a lie often enough, people will believe it. And so the way that they brought about the near extermination of the Jews in Germany was that they would tell lies that generated fear, that activated hate, that led to acts of exclusion, that ultimately led to acts of extinction. And I was going through the Holocaust Museum I think it's 3 years ago now, maybe 4. And it was a heavy experience for me, and I was prepared for that. Because the hate that is seen in that mass execution of people, it weighs on you heavy. If you go to see the Holocaust Museum in D.C., plan on doing something fun in the evening, or you'll have a hard time getting to sleep. It's really that heavy. But it was hitting me extra hard, and I said, why? Why is it hitting, and I was trying to wrestle with that and sort it out. And then it just hit me right between the eyes that same pattern is what is being used against LGBT people today. Tell a lie often enough, people will believe it. That'll lead to fear, that'll lead to hate, that'll lead to acts of exclusion. You're not welcome here. That can even lead to acts of extinction. You can be killed for being gay or lesbian, put to death legally by the government in a number of countries of the world yet today. And so getting to the point where you recognize that these are people that have believed a lie, I think is an important first step trying to begin the forgiveness process for acts of hate. If we don't forgive them, their hate becomes our hate. And the hate that we let loose within us becomes an anger almost as volatile as theirs. And that's a difficult thing to do. I acknowledge that. But we have to do our best to get there. I don't know if you've seen the movie Gandhi, but one of the scenes I'll never forget is when they're demonstrating against the exclusive sales ability that the government had for salt. They were marching to the salt factory, and the soldiers were there ready for them. And line after line after line of people would step forward and take their beating. Others would come in and carry them away and tend to their wounds, and then the next group would step forward and take their beating. Why would they do that? Because they believed in something greater than the abuse that they were going to suffer. One of the things that I'm so proud of your generation about is that more and more of you are willing to come out and say, I'm out. This is who I am. And in your own way, say, deal with it. And that is what's going to change things. Telling your stories, whether it's a hard story, a hurtful story, a faith story. Joanne and I often talk about how coming out was a significant act in our faith development. It shouldn't surprise us that we seem closer to God when we're seeking to live a life of integrity and authenticity. That shouldn't be a surprise. And that kind of process, being able to tell your stories, is what changes hearts and minds. It won't be law. You can change a law, but it isn't going to change people's hearts and minds. It's just like in business. You can have a wonderful policy, but if you don't have great practices to go with it, the policy doesn't mean a thing. Same with laws. Until people's hearts and minds are changed, the laws don't really mean that much. And so telling your story is much, much more important than you think it is, because it really does touch people. Hate in the abstract is easy. When you put a face to it, it's much, much harder. Many of these acts of violence that you're talking about were acts of hate in the abstract. People didn't know the person except that they knew that they were trans or gay or lesbian. Let's go out and find a gay to kill tonight. It was really, for some, it was that kind of thinking. And so putting your face to it is what can give some people with those kind of thoughts pause. Make them stop and think. Oh yeah, I can think of someone like that. And the reality is, for every person who's gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans, they're just one life. With the lives they touch, family, friends, it becomes a huge, huge army going forward. Already in Michigan, the polling shows that the majority of Michigan voters are in favor of equal equality for LGBT people. And almost the majority, or just a little bit more than a majority, are in favor of marriage equality. We may not see it in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but hearts and minds are being changed, and that's eventually what will bring it about the results we want. At the PFLAG convention, that we had people from all over the country, as well as Peru, Portugal, and Mexico, and Puerto Rico. And all of them were telling the same story. You know, the tide of history is in our favor. Things are starting to change. We're going to get there. And there was just a tremendous optimism among those people that were gathered there. PFLAG, if you don't know, stands for Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbian and Gays, Bisexual, Transgender, or whatever. It calls all of that, but some of that is silent. I did a presentation about the T being silent, but in PFLAG. But the change is happening, and we will get there. And I would encourage any of you that are holding hate within you, or anger, to begin working on that, because if you don't deal with it, it just gets in there and it eats you away and can turn you into one of them, you know, if you're not careful. And I just don't want any of you to go there. But it's easy to do, you know, and it's a tough issue. Thank you. Good question. Did I answer it? All right.
You mentioned bullies earlier, and sometimes people don't realize that they are bullies. I work with a lot of people who, on a very frequent basis, make homophobic or transphobic slurs without thinking twice about it. You know, along with racial slurs and all kinds of other prejudice that they all have. And the only ally I really have in that entire store is my manager, which, you know, thank goodness at least I have my manager.
Good ally.
But she doesn't often work when I do, when I work with them. And I was wondering what an appropriate thing to say or do to make them, to ask them to stop without, I don't know, getting in their crossfire, because I have to work with them on, you know, a frequent basis, and I don't really want to get on their bad side, but I would like to inform them that they're being extremely offensive quite frequently, and I'm not just sure the best way to do that, so I've been keeping quiet, and that makes me even more uncomfortable because I don't like keeping quiet when I should be speaking up.
Have any of you, or all of you, maybe seen the PSA, the public service announcements about "that's so gay," when people say that? Part of the strategy of those PSAs was to get people to the point where they would speak up about how that language was offensive. And I think one of the things you can do in the workplace is simply say to that person, you know, I have friends who are, whatever word they used, whether it was an ethnic slur or a sexual orientation or gender identity slur, that are that way. I would appreciate it. And that language is offensive to me, and I'd appreciate it if you'd avoid it. I think something as Non-personal is that, because you're deflecting it. You're saying, I know someone else, so it's not, the potential of it coming back at you is lessened. And by putting it in that, couching it in that kind of language, maybe you can get through and let them know that that kind of speech hurts you because you have friends that are like that.
I'm just a bucket of questions tonight.
That's right.
You mentioned the silent T, and I recently just wrote a paper about transgendered inclusion in the LGB community. Why do you think they are lumped together with them, and why do you think the T is silent so often?
Good question. I get the question, the first part of the question often about why is the T with the LGB? Because GLB or LGB or BLG or however you want to organize it has to do with sexual orientation. Gender identity is where the T comes in. Part of the reason they're lumped together is they suffer similar discrimination. Another part of it is T's are often connected with the LGBs because the question is, well, were you gay then or are you gay now when you transition? You know, and so that becomes, you know, a legitimate question in people's minds, so they're lumping it together. I'm grateful, frankly, that most of the civil rights groups now are adamant about not leaving the T's behind, okay? There was a time only a couple years ago where the president of a leading civil rights group in this country said to the crowd that was at Southern Comfort, which is the largest gathering in the world of trans people, about 800 or 1,000 of us were there in Atlanta, said, we will always stand for the inclusion of transgender. And less than 2 months later, that same person pushed for taking transgender or gender identity out of the Employment Non-Discrimination Bill. And they have not received any of my money since then because of that. But they heard such an outcry from all of the other LGBT groups around the country, state groups and local groups, that it was clear to everyone that they were in the minority there, that LGBT is going to come together. I think part of the reason is what Ben Franklin said to the revolutionaries: we must hang together or most assuredly we'll hang separately. And so I think there's a unity that we have because of this extra strength that it gives us. One of the neat things that PFLAG did this year is lobbying. And for the first time, people were coming back from lobbying day said, we didn't have to explain what PFLAG stood for. They knew. And that's a huge milestone. You know, when people are so used to you being there, talking about your issues, that you no longer have to explain yourself. And I think that kind of collective strength is an important one. The second part of your question is, the T is silent. Here's my theory on it, okay? And I think it's changing rapidly. But where transgender is now is where gay and lesbian was 20 years ago, where people were just starting to be more public about being out, and some of the social change that we were seeing starting to take place. And now if somebody comes out as gay or lesbian, it's really, you know, 10 pages into the newspaper. It's not front page anymore. But trans issues still get a lot of ink because they're seen as different and unusual and new. And I think the time is going to be compressed so much so that the T won't be silent anymore, that a T will be ignored like the LGB part will, because it'll become so common. And I think that day is coming quickly. I really do, because a lot of the issues have been debunked. You know, the groups that are opposed to gender identity and a civil rights bill that keep bringing up bathrooms and other kinds of stuff like that. You know, it's just been shown to be rotten debunking. What I love, great statistic about marriage equality, okay? And one of the things that the opponents of marriage equality always say is that It'll damage heterosexual relationships. It'll cause divorces and everything else. The state in the union that has the lowest divorce rate is Massachusetts, which is the first state to have marriage equality in 2004. You had a question over here.
Again, going with the political questions here, sorry. There's a lot of argument in the LGBT alphabet soup community about why is it we have marriage equality as the top of our, excuse me, as the top of our agenda list or whatever, as if we have any actual agenda. But, there's concern about, well, once marriage equality happens, then those of us who are in greater need of other protections will be left out in the cold. And so therefore, this issue is something we need to back burner. On the flip side, marriage equality with trans people, there is potential for marriage equality. I know here in Kent County, there are at least 4 trans people that are legally married to their spouse, and it is a same-sex marriage post-surgery. So, I'm just wondering why one of the reasons why we as trans people don't bring that up in the conversation of, hey, listen, these people are being silly. There's always going to be marriage equal or same-sex marriage, but also why are we not also beating the drum a little bit louder of, you know what, it doesn't matter if I can put a ring on her finger if I can't hold down a job because they can discriminate against me.
Yep. I think that's a very, very, very fair question. In many ways, trans marriages may be the thing that undoes the whole anti-marriage equality movement, because so far, no marriage has ever been undone where one person in the marriage transitioned and they chose to stay together. So
the closest thing I found was one of the legal problems when women I know, she actually was at risk of losing her parental rights for legal matters because she changed her gender on her daughter's birth.
there can be problems, but so far they've never undone a marriage. And I agree with you that marriage equality should not be the highest priority, and here's why. Equality, you know, if you say that LGBT people are considered equal by the state, marriage equality will fall, employment rights will fall, everything will fall. You know, when we say all men are created equal, do we mean only men? Do we mean only white men? No, we don't anymore. Although we might have when it was written. But now we understand that part of our Declaration of Independence to say that these inalienable rights, life, liberty, the gay agenda, belong to everybody. Barney Frank talked about the gay agenda at the PFLAG convention. He stopped in for a few minutes and greeted us. We got a nice letter from Barack Obama as well. But anyways, Barney Frank defined the gay agenda as get a job, get married, join the army. You know, he's talking about the big issues that everybody talks about. But I really do believe if we can get equality, you know, and like for the Civil Rights Ordinance in Michigan, the Elliott Larson law, if we can get gender identity, sexual orientation in there, marriage will fall pretty soon after that, because that will cover employment and housing, and it'll fall. It'll happen. You've seen that in other states. So I think that's, to me, that's where the priority needs to be. But I would never tell anybody not to seek marriage equality, because I think that's important too. But I think the linchpin is the equal rights, civil rights issues. Yeah. Oh, you got one over here first?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen a growing movement online, like I don't know how big it is, but to instead of using the acronym LGBT or LGBTQIA to use GSM for gender and sexual minorities. And I didn't know if you'd heard about that or, you know, what your thoughts are on that.
I don't care what they call us as long as they give us equal rights. I really, you know, I have friends that don't like the word queer, friends that do like the word queer, in terms of describing gay and lesbian people, not gender queer people. I have people that, you know, are proud of the word queer, some that aren't, gay, lesbian. The labels don't mean too much, and in fact, sometimes the labels get in the way. We're people, we're part of those, all are endowed with these rights. Let's recognize us as that. So I'm not opposed to that. I'm not sure it's a cause that I'd get behind because I think there's more important battles, but that's just me. If you want to go there, that's fine.
Where do you think understanding of genderqueer and non-binary gender identity is in relation to, say, LGBT or trans issues right now?
I think it's an important part of understanding, in my frame of reference, the rich diversity of God's creation. You know, that, and whether you're a person of faith or not, just to recognize that humanity, however it happened to be, created or whatever, is filled with diversity. In terms of DNA, we're all 99.9% alike. Why should we get so hung up over that 0.1%? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. So whatever our ethnic diversity, whatever our sexual orientation, whatever our gender expression, you know, what's the issue? You know, it shouldn't be an issue. And so genderqueer and other things, I think, need to be included in the battle for civil rights. The ability to express yourself is certainly covered in our Constitution. And your freedom of expression, I think, includes, and court cases have borne this out, it includes how you choose to dress and how you choose to present yourself. I don't know if you know the history of transgender law as it relates to Michigan, but Michigan is in the Sixth Circuit Court, which includes Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The Sixth Circuit Court has a body of case law, 2 significant cases, that have said, in essence, when Title VII, the 1964 Civil Rights Law, says sex, it includes gender. And one case was Smith v. Salem, the other is Barnes v. the City of Cincinnati. One was a fireman, one was a policeman. Both were F to M. No, both were M to F. And in both cases, the court said, yes, when the Civil Rights Law said sex, it includes gender and gender expression. So in many ways, trans people have more protection in Michigan than gay or lesbian people. You know, if you're not in one of those special cities, you can be fired for being gay or lesbian in Michigan. They'd have a harder time doing it for you being trans.
All right, I have a quick question since someone's raising their hand. I remember the day, the place, and where I was at when I heard your story, actually. You kind of rocked my world at that point. And for everybody who's, who falls underneath the trans umbrella, allies, everybody, do you have any like positive words of wisdom now that looking back at your life and being a role model for many of us, what kind of words of wisdom do you have for us?
A couple thoughts come to mind. One is a closet is a terrible place to live. And I think most of you know that. The other is that being who you are is one of the most liberating things you can do in life. Trying to be who someone else thinks you should be is one of the most confining things you can do in life. I often get asked, don't you wish you'd come out sooner? Well, I do, but when I was growing up, nobody talked about transgender. You know, the only thing that everybody talked about was Renee Richards, the tennis player that changed her her sex, although there were many others who had done it as well. She was rather public. The person who broke the story about Sir Edmund Hillary climbing Mount Everest was a trans person, by the way. And I guess, yeah, I wish I had come out sooner, but on the other hand, I wouldn't have met Joanne and wouldn't have the 3 boys I have and the grandsons and granddaughter I have. So regrets, yeah. But I think for a trans person, it does very little good to look backward. You know, look forward. You know, kind of that old country western song, I'm just an old chunk of coal, but I'm going to be a diamond someday. You know, that idea of looking forward, of saying, it, you know, yeah, it's going to get better and I'm going to be out there. I don't regret for a moment coming out. And I don't regret for a moment the publicity. We didn't seek publicity, still don't, but it finds us every once in a while. But both Joanne and I are willing to tell our stories, because the more people hear the stories, the more hearts and minds get changed. And so that's kind of why we were willing to be the public figures we ended up being. It wasn't intent, but it's the only way we could get justice was to go public with our story. And we were totally blown out of the water by how quickly it spread. One of the neat parts of that, when I was doing some lobbying in DC, and this was just a coincidental cosmic ordering of the universe or God thing, depending on your frame of reference, but the day we were lobbying to meet our senators and our congressmen was the day that Newsweek came out with a story, the front page story, on the cover about questions about gender identity and birth. And our story was part of the story that was covered in the Newsweek magazine. So we had a chance to point to this and say, here's part of why we're here today, you know, and it really was kind of a neat thing because they all had it on their coffee tables laying there, and we could use it to help them think about what we were there to talk about with the National Center for Transgender Equality. Someone else?
Yeah. I grew up in Jackson, so I remember the day that your story came out and the
Me too.
the preceding week. And I remember going to this restaurant with my dad that we went to every week, and they had newspaper machines right outside, you know, a whole bunch of different ones. And I remember 3 out of the 4 of them had your picture on the front cover. And I remember thinking, well, that looks like an interesting story. If it's making 3 newspapers, I want to read it. So then I did, and you were the first person to inspire me about learning what transgender was and all that other fun stuff. And since then, I'm on the board for Trans Spectrum, the group that we have on campus here. And I do like to do education and stuff, so I'll be speaking at our cut and paste events later this week. But I just want to let you know that you are one of the first people that I was inspired by, and I think that it's really remarkable that you did come out the way you did, because I know that took a lot.
Thank you. And people often say, you know, I admire your courage and everything else, but it shouldn't take courage to be who you are, you know, and that's what I say to people. I really didn't feel like I was into doing anything noble or courage. I was just trying to be me. And that was it. So that story, by the way, did win some state and national awards for journalism. So the author got his deserved honors. That was an unusual day for us because we'd been attending a church for about 5 weeks as Julie and Joanne. I hadn't transitioned full time, but when we were going to that church, it was always as Julie and Joanne. And our thinking was we didn't want them to have to go through the transition process. I knew I was transitioning full time in the near future, but we knew that day would be make it or break it day at that church because nobody except the pastor knew. I had a colleague at Spring Arbor University who had gone to the pastor and said, would Julie and Joanne be welcome here? And the pastor said, by all means. But we were worried. But person after person after person, family after family, came up to us and said, we're so glad you're here. We didn't know. Thought you were a tall woman. you know. Better than one of my students who said, "I just thought you were a tall Russian wrestler." But yeah, so it was good, you know. And Jackson is a very conservative community, but I've never had anybody be in my face about it. In fact, when Joanne and I go out to eat, we still have people who come up to the table and say, "Are you Julie Nemechek?" And I'll say yes, and they'll say, "I just want you to know we're 100% behind you." You know, and so that it just means a lot to hear that, because I think, again, when you put a face to it, hate is a lot harder.
I come from around the Jackson area, Litchfield. I don't know if you know where that is. But I know like how conservative that area is and everything. And I was just wondering, and that I know how hard it would be to like break out of that element. And I was just wondering how it's been for you and your wife as far as like going from your life then to your life now, lobbying and all of that stuff, and like how that adjustment was.
We lost some friends, but we gained some friends, and in many ways we found out who our real friends were. You know, when you come out, that's what takes place. Joanne and I are just on the same page when it comes to being out there. Joanne has spoken from the steps of the state capitol as I have, you know, and she's just got a nice award from P. Flag Jackson for being an ally. She considered, one of the hardest things that she had to deal with was the idea that people would perceive her as a lesbian even though she doesn't see herself as one. I always joke, she doesn't like it when I do it, but she's not here tonight. I said, she's not a lesbian, she just sleeps with one. But she's gotten used to it enough that she just kind of groans and rolls her eyes at me. But, that was a hard thing for her to deal with, especially in that conservative environment. But she's gotten past that. I mean, we'll hold hands in public. If I drop her off at work, you know, I'll kiss her goodbye, and we just really don't care what other people think. And in terms of activism, we're both, if we can find a place to fit it into our schedule, we'll do it. You know, as long as we don't go into more debt doing it, which is, yeah, you know, I did a lot of activism for a long time at Spring Arbor University's expense, you know, but I can't do that forever. And so I enjoy doing it and do it whenever I can for as little. You know, I tell churches if you can cover my travel costs, I'll be there. High schools, I'll usually do that for free unless they're a long way away. So, because they don't have much money either. So, but it's, you know, there's a place for you to be active. And activism isn't for everybody, okay? And I'm old enough that I don't care what people think. You know, you get to that old fart stage and just, it doesn't matter what people think of you. And so I'm pretty much out there and don't care. But if you're worried about those kind of things, find another place for your activism to be. There's so many behind the scenes kind of things where activism is needed, where you can be a support person, you know, sending out flyers and mailers and all of that kind of stuff. So, find a place where you can do your thing. But it's changed our lives in a lot of ways, changed our theology a little bit, strengthened it, my youngest son likes to say. And so, yeah, it's been good. Our relationship with the kids have grown, 2 out of 3. So it's been good.
You've definitely been heroic in staying in a very conservative / hostile environment.
A lot of those people are my Facebook friends.
And I guess my question is, with the current political atmosphere here in Michigan and it getting so almost openly hostile, at least on the political level, there's a lot of people that are talking about just running away, going to another state, myself included. I recently was chastised by a friend of mine. How are you going to create change if you run away from the fight all the time? How do you prevent yourself from getting that fatigue that goes along with all of us that are fighting the fight day to day?
I think part of the way of avoiding the becoming battle weary is to take time to celebrate the victories. Last Tuesday, there were a tremendous amount of LGBT victories coast to coast. Gay mayors being elected, gay council members being elected for the first time ever. The person that they were pushing hard in Iowa to try to get into the Senate so they could repeal same-sex marriage there was defeated. You know, and so celebrating those victories whenever and wherever they happen, I think is an important part, because otherwise you get kind of myopic or nearsighted and you see only the little battles that are around you, but to celebrate the battles that are being won all over the country. Michigan will get there. It may be the last of the 50 states, but it'll get there. I really believe that. The tide of public opinion is changing. The generational differences are huge. You know, I've said before, when us old farts die off, it's going to be a whole different world. 20-somethings are about working in places that honor diversity, worshiping in places that honor diversity, living in places that honor diversity. Not all of them, but as a huge majority, 70, 80%. And if you take 80 and over, it's about 180 degrees the other direction. And it's just a perfect bar chart in terms of if you look at the demographics. And so the future is going to be a lot different than the present. And you got to keep that in your head or you'll go nuts with the little defeats that take place. I think it's important to recognize that you're not alone, to share your pains as well as your victories with others, and to find that strength that comes from unity. You know, that otherwise you can get burned out, and it'll eat at you. I have a good friend who's been an activist for a long, long time, and he just had to get out of activism for a while because he said anger was eating away at him, that it wasn't happening fast enough, and some of the stupid things that were being done and said, he couldn't wash them out of his mind as quickly as he would like, and he needed to get out of it for at least for a while. So that would be the other thing, is every once in a while give yourself a rest. You know, that the word recreate can also be pronounced recreate. You know, and so recognizing that when we have times of recreation or rest, it's time to restore our batteries. And sometimes you just have to do self-care and self-help and say, I need a break. And if someone tells you that, if you're a friend, you'll accept that and say, okay, let us know when you're ready. And give that person the time, the chance to catch their breath. I have business cards that if you want to email me a question that you didn't want to ask in public, or at 2 in the morning something comes up to you, instead of calling me, email me, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you've had. It's been a delightful conversation. I hope this week of remembrance will be a meaningful one for you, and it'll be a positive thing, that you'll remember the value of remembering and celebrate those lives as lives that died in the cause that we can go forward with. And mourn the losses, yes, but also celebrate the fact that it will get better, that these dead have not died in vain, and things are moving in the right direction. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to thank you all for coming as well, too. Just a reminder about our cut and paste on Tuesday and Friday. It will be happening, as well as O&A on Wednesday at 8 p.m. at the Clock Tower. We'll be doing a vigil. And Amnesty International Wednesday midday will be also where you can give them $1 and you can put a handprint on a big peace sign that has to do with LGBT rights as well, too. Thank you so much for coming, Julie, and thank you everybody else. Yes. I don't know all the details, so why don't you?
Or Kalamazoo. 4010 Kalamazoo.
Out and about, we'll be carpooling to that event. We're going to meet down by the Circle Drive in the Queer Corner by the LGBT Center. Yeah, we do. At 4:45 and leave at 5 o'clock on Sunday. So, thank you.